A scholar who has become a tax lawyer in New York City, and a law school professor at the University of Alabama since 1994. Susan is married. She is the mother of 2 children. She is a United Methodist Church member, and she is one of the stars in our DVD, Golden Rule Politics, Reclaiming the Rightful Role of Faith in Politics, which is available over here at this table at the end of the luncheon. Susan is the author of a number of pieces. Most recently, the least of these, Fair Taxes and the Moral Duty of Christians. She is a friend of ours. We hope you will welcome her. We believe that she is in the outrageous business of social reformation and the pursuit of social justice. Know that after her presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers that will be moderated by one of our board members, Joe Phelps. And so now please welcome Susan, Professor Hamill, to come and speak to us about fair taxation and the moral duty of Christians.
You know, when folks introduce me, I always beg them to leave out the IRS business, because inevitably that destroys my credibility with all people of goodwill. There can't be any other more hated government agency than the Internal Revenue Service. And then he mentions being a lawyer in New York City. Among good Southerners, that's another point that can potentially discredit me. Putting those 2 credentials aside, Robert forgot to mention the most important credential, so I will add it myself. I'm a graduate of the Beeson Divinity School of Samford University in Alabama, the reddest of all the red states. And Tamby is here, one of my classmates, and how many Beeson grads do we have? All right. Beeson is interdenominational, but very Baptist. The Baptists definitely run the show at Beeson. Beeson is conservative, evangelical in orientation, and orthodox to the core. There are only 3 styles at Beeson. There's conservative, very conservative, and supersized conservative. The moderates are all in the closet at Beeson. Beeson is still divided on the ordination of women issue, on all of the hot-button social issues of the day, abortion, stem cell research, gay marriage. Beeson falls firmly on the conservative side. The reason why I bothered to tell you all this is I want you to understand the theological orientation of which I was educated and of which I subscribe to. Although, truth be said, as far as Beeson is concerned, I'm one of the moderates in the closet. So why am I here to talk to you about taxation? There is no more unpleasant subject than taxation. Let's let that sink in. There is not a one of us here that enjoys paying taxes. If you do, be quiet, because the rest of you will beat you up in the locker room, because you are a candidate for sainthood. The truth be told, none of us like paying taxes, and most of us will do whatever we can to minimize our share. Because a tax is a compulsory payment that the government forces us to part with our hard-earned money to meet some amorphous common good that we don't get any credit for. Let's think about that. What do our tax revenues buy? They buy roads, police, the courts, education. They buy all kinds of things that we utilize them, but we don't notice it, or we don't utilize them, but we don't get any credit for the taxes we pay to support that kind of thing. And so the common myth in the church is that, A, taxes are bad because it takes away from the charitable impulse when we pass around the plate. albeit you do get to deduct what you put in the plate. And two, it has nothing to do with the church. That it's one of those bad, secular, government, ungodly things that people in the church don't have to be concerned with. Often the verse in Matthew 22:21, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, very often misused and misunderstood, an excuse for ignoring tax policy, for perpetuating bad tax policy, for tolerating taxes that oppress the poor. Now, when I went to Beeson, I was just as guilty as everybody else. Being a tax expert for years while I was at the IRS and at the New York law firm, and I like to say at the firm I was on the express train to hell, and at the IRS I was on the local train to hell, and that's the truth. Because in both of those places I was using my knowledge and expertise in this highly complicated secular area, mostly for my own good and for the good of wealthy paying clients. Right? So I end up at the Beeson Divinity School, and for the first time I notice that my home state has very oppressive tax laws on the poorest individuals. And I decided to do something about it by writing the thesis. That's the scholar part. Well, my job today is to convince you, as good church leaders, that tax policy is something you need to address in your pulpits and in your Sunday school classes. And you need to shake up the tax experts in your pews, the accountants and the lawyers that sit there Sunday after Sunday and then perpetuate and tolerate the oppressive policies, as I did for so many years myself. Now, we need to get down to a little business, because y'all are smart people and you're not going to take what I say as gospel unless I at least try to prove it a little bit. Why is tax, this nasty, compulsory law forces you to pay, why is it an issue of justice? Well, the answer is the law has to force us to pay because we're too greedy to pay the share ourselves. Let that sink in. How many times have you heard somebody say that the church, in its charitable compassion, will provide for the poor? Do you believe that? Do you believe that as fallen human beings, mired in the sin of greed, that we have the ability to be charitable enough? I don't. The orthodox approach, no one is exempt from the fall of humankind, except the one who died on the cross. But the rest of us, unfortunately, are stuck with fighting the sin of greed. That's why taxes have to be compelled. Preachers, can you imagine passing the hat around every April 15th to run the government? Would it work? No. So right there, we're sort of stuck with compulsory laws that force us to pay because we're too greedy to do otherwise. And so the questions of justice come down to two basic points. How much are we going to raise? And for what purpose? You know, is roads, police, and courts enough? Or maybe we care a little bit about education. Or maybe we care a little bit about food stamps. You know, those are moral issues. And then the second issue, and this is the one that really makes people's blood boil. Whose ox are we going to gore? Who's going to pay for it? How are we going to apportion this burden for paying? Those are issues of justice. The Bible was very concerned with justice. The law and the prophets are filled with commands and orations of justice. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, stop doing wrong, learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Jesus himself was very concerned about justice. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, I have come to fulfill the law and the prophets. Matthew 23:23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. Well, how do these principles of justice speak to taxes? That was the subject of my scholarly work at Beeson, to figure that out. At Beeson, they taught us that the Bible speaks to every issue and concern of human life. There is no corner of human life for which the Bible fails to speak to. Now, figuring out what it says sometimes is no easy matter and what it means. That's why they made us study languages. Tamby and I were joking about our time in Greek by Fire with Dr. Todd in the summer of 2000. They made us take languages because in order to figure out what it means today, you have to figure out what it meant to the first audience, and then you have to figure out the principles that speak to the concerns of today. And there's this whole process called exegesis and hermeneutics, and I'm not going to bore you with that. It's all in my footnotes on the web in my articles, so please feel free to indulge. And it's not as boring as my tax footnotes. My tax footnotes will totally put you to sleep and could put the sleeping pill business out of business if people would only read my footnotes. At any rate, what I determined, now remember, this has the full support of the Beeson faculty. That's important. Remember, the conservatives, was that that biblical principles of justice require that the community at large embrace and protect the reasonable opportunity of all God's people to reach their potential. Now, where did I get that? Well, let's start with Genesis. We're all made in the image, right? We're all made in the image of God, and we all have the potential to carry out His kingdom work on earth in some way. And then you go further into the Old Testament, into the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and you find all these strange commands of justice. 7-year releases of debt, 7-year releases of servants, land tenure rights, and you scratch your head and you wonder what is going on. See, that's where the Beeson education really came in handy. Those laws of justice were there to ensure that all Israelites, the people of God, who fell on hard times, either due to bad luck or bad choices, had a reasonable opportunity to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. See, the way it worked back in the Near East is you lost your land, then you went into debt, and then you sold yourself into servanthood. And so the releases and land tenure rights were designed to prop people back up and give them a chance to be whole again. Well, what's the reasonable opportunity of today? Do I have any teachers in the room? It's not land anymore. It's education, isn't it? Yeah. Most of my work, the detailed part of it, focuses on K through 12 education. Because education is the quintessential, reasonable opportunity for God's children today. And that means all of God's children, not just the fluffy, upper middle class white ones, thank you very much. All the children. So, in deciding tax revenues to be raised, we need to have this reasonable opportunity concept in our heads. Now, I've been accused of all kinds of mean things. Communism, socialism, collectivism, hedonism, crazyism. Somebody even made fun of my lipstick and makeup once, which I thought was beating below the belt a bit. My work does not stand for equality of result. There is no such thing. And in fact, being made in the image is being made differently. Not everybody is as smart as everybody else. That's very politically incorrect, but it's true. There's no perfect justice on earth. That won't happen until Jesus comes again to judge the living and the dead. Reasonable opportunity is just what it says. It is nowhere near all that bad left-wing stuff that you've heard about. If it was, I wouldn't have the full support of the Beeson Divinity School faculty. Believe me. It's a guide for a debate. Now, let's get to the harder question. How are we going to pay for this reasonable opportunity? Whose ox are we going to gore? Well, I did a detailed study of the teachings on wealth in the New Testament. And this is the 2006 work. This was post-Alabama. And it all can be summed up in Luke chapter 12, verse 48. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. This is a really hard message, ladies and gentlemen. It is one that rocks the church and the people to the core. Because the message is those of us with more have to bear a proportionally greater burden, which I define in terms of moderate progressivity. What that means is this notion of everybody being the same, flatness. It's unbiblical. But you have all these people running around wearing the cross, including our current outgoing president, saying such heresy. What have they forgotten? Let's go back to the book of Genesis. Where did all the wealth come from? I think it came from God. And I think we're stewards. And where did we get the ability to create wealth? Where did I get the ability to figure out taxes? I didn't get it from myself. To assume that our abilities that made us who we were, which means some of us create more wealth and some of us are smarter and some of us make more money, that came from God. Why are we all so different in such ways? I have no idea. He didn't tell me. However, to assume that it's all mine and that there are no greater obligations because for some mysterious reasons I've been endowed with more is to deny the message of the gospel and to deny God as our sovereign. And so in this great debate over this nasty issue of tax policy, we have to keep at the forefront the reasonable opportunity, especially for the least among us, and the moderately progressive greater obligation of those of us with more. That has to be at the forefront of the debate. And it's not. Let's take a quick look at our tax policy today. I'm embroiled in a huge research project looking at all 50 states. Yes, it's a task. 31 of our states grossly violate the moral principles of Judeo-Christian ethics. 31 states are as bad, worse, or almost as bad as my home state of Alabama. That is horrible. The other 19 states have problems, but they are more complicated and less severe. There is no state in this country right now that gets it right. No state. Yet, every state except for Hawaii, Alaska, and Utah is overwhelmingly majority Christian and Jewish. What's going on at the national level? Well, we went through a round of first-term Bush tax cuts that benefited the wealthy. And what was the great debate about that? What was the reasons? It all had to do with personal autonomy and rewarding the top earners because they did it themselves. You can go into the footnotes of my 2006 article. I absolutely document the moral debate surrounding the Bush tax cuts, and it was based on a form of atheism known as objectivism, which is the worship of the individual. If, as a nation, we continue to debate tax policy in atheistic terms, we are inevitably going to end up with worse and worse policies as far as the poor. So what is my cry to the clergy? Well, why are we not talking about this extremely important issue in a biblical way? I mean, I thought long and hard about that. And I think it goes to the question of cost. Because in order to stand up in the pulpit and challenge your parishioners to think about this issue in a biblical way, guess whose ox you have to gore? The chair of the building committee, the chair of the pastor-parish relations committee, the grand poobah that gives to charity and thinks he's wonderful, but he's indifferent to the high sales tax pulverizing the poor. Yeah, you have to tell that person he is not as much of a saint as he thinks he is, and that's a tough job. And I'm not going to pretend it's easy. I mean, at least I have tenure at the University of Alabama. Believe me, some of them would love to get rid of me, but they can't. You see, biblically based tax policy is a high sacrifice issue for the most of us. It's asking us to submit to the nasty law demanding more and not giving us any credit. We don't get a building named after us, and we don't get clapped at the charity ball. We don't get anything for it. That's pretty high sacrifice. And so what has happened with the church, and I'm going to hit hard now, so, don't throw a tomato at me, please. Because remember, I was just as guilty as everybody else of this. We have taken faith and put it in a box on Sunday morning mostly. And we have limited our public issues to the low sacrifice issues. Not theologically unimportant. Don't get me wrong. When I say low sacrifice, I mean that how the issue comes out doesn't cost us much personally. It doesn't hit our pocketbook. What are some of these issues? They're the very hot button issues that Beeson lines up conservative on. Gay marriage. Let's throw that one out. Doesn't cost you much unless you happen to be gay or you know somebody who is that you really care about. But you can really feel like a good Christian to get up and quote Genesis and say what a terrible thing this is. So a lot of people confine their public concern to that issue. Stem cell research. Again, a very theologically complicated and ethical issue, but unless you are sick or have a sick relative, not much personal cost to get out front and condemn that. Ditto for euthanasia. And my favorite one, the big A. And I'm not talking about the scarlet letter A of Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'm talking about the other A. Confining that issue to the legal concern only is a low sacrifice issue. Because the sanctity of life goes from the womb to the tomb. And as a church, we have cut it off at the womb and showed little concern beyond that. I have linked in my 2006 article with footnotes Judeo-Christian tax policy and the pro-life agenda. And I have stated pretty forcefully, this is kind of some nasty stuff here, but it's true. It's absolutely true. That those of you, unless you are also willing to bring your faith-based moral principles into the high sacrifice realm of tax policy, your opposition to abortion is just another low sacrifice proposition being driven by something other than genuine faith-based ethics and has no credibility as a moral position. We must embrace the tax policy we need to take care of mothers in unfortunate circumstances, to make abortion as unattractive an option as possible. In my home state of Alabama, depending on who you ask, as many as a quarter of the rural women give birth without ever seeing a doctor beforehand. That is not a pro-life state. As a nation, we're declining. As a nation, we are embracing low sacrifice issues, and we are ignoring high sacrifice issues. And as a result, the gulf of injustice is widening. just like a fault line with an earthquake. And I predict that if the church doesn't rise up and demand an end to this foolishness, demand that we take on the high sacrifice issues, the hard issues, as well as all the other issues, that the decline will continue. Only the church has the moral authority to insist that we embrace high sacrifice issues, particularly tax policy. And I challenge the church to do so. Because if we don't, you will fall by the wayside, just like Alabama. Our Republican conservative Governor Riley, in 2003, floated a major tax reform proposal that would have materially corrected much of our injustice. And it required a great deal of sacrifice from the most of us. And it would have cut taxes for well over half of Alabamians. And do you know who voted against it in droves? Low-income people. Because they're so undereducated, oppressed, they were fooled by all the distortions and lies on TV by the opposition. We have lost our ability in Alabama to use the tools of democracy to better ourselves. And if the nation continues to allow this gulf of injustice to grow, every state in the union will become like us. Some of you are already like us. And I believe only the church has the moral ability to turn us on the right path. And so I ask and I pray for all of you to challenge your congregations, especially your wealthier, better educated people, to embrace high sacrifice issues, especially tax policy. And I appreciate any questions you have. As I said to my hosts, nothing can be harder to deal with than some of the back counties of Alabama where people are really hurting. I've been shouted at, screamed at, called names. There's nothing you can ask or say that's going to bother me very much. So let loose and be honest.
Requiring the community at large to take care of the poor. And you made reference to us thinking in a biblical way, but how would you respond to the statement that the Bible was written for people of faith and not necessarily for a secular society such as the United States of America?
Well, that is true. It was written for people of faith. And so my analysis has no moral authority to someone who has not accepted the gospel. However, most people in the United States have accepted the gospel, at least according to the Pew studies that I cite in my footnotes. And we have just as much right as anybody else to take our values to the voting booth and to take our values to the streets, lawful free speech, right? And all I'm doing is challenging the faithful to use those rights in the full way. You know?
Questions?
Why do you think it is that Baptists of similar faith and practice in other countries tend to be much more progressive when it comes to issues of social safety net and tax policy?
The question is, why are the Baptists in other countries more progressive than the Baptists in our country? I can only answer this anecdotally. Not being a Baptist myself, that limits me some. And to be honest, this is the first engagement I've done that has been almost totally Baptist. Most of the time, y'all have been sprinkled out. So I'm a little intimidated. Other than at Beeson, of course. But having said that, I believe, and this is just based on my experience in rural counties in Alabama, I believe that in the United States, that the hardworking people have been fooled into thinking, A, that the low sacrifice issues are the issues that matter in terms of what's oppressing them and what's not oppressing them. And B, and I hate to say this, I apologize if I offend anybody, but in America, we are still saddled with the issue of race. And I believe In Alabama, this trick has been perfected to a high degree. The wealthy elite whites, which were called the Bourbons for many years, and I have done an extensive study of Alabama history on this, successfully convinced, and are still convincing, lower-class struggling whites that it's black folk who are responsible for their oppression. And of course, black folk have always been a little more progressive because they've been at the bottom of the pile, the real bottom, for so long. And I don't think we've gotten over that yet. And it's a very uncomfortable topic, and it fits in nice with the DVD that you're working on. But I think until we can shed this unfortunate legacy of racism and recognize that all struggling people who are living hand to mouth are equally oppressed, whether you're black or white, and that all of us of means need to be more concerned about that. And whites who are using the race thing to keep things as they are, sitting in the pews, well, they're going to have somebody to answer to, in my view. But I think the race thing, we have that more with our history than the other countries. I hope I haven't offended anybody too much, but there it is.
The only offense we took was when you made the reference to Baptist and sprinkling in the same sentence. But.
Yeah, Methodist sprinkle, Baptist pour. I'm terribly sorry. Yeah.
I have a question. Could you give us the specifics in Alabama, for example, of how the tax policy is regressive, like in terms of who pays what share and how the sales tax, how all that actually, the specifics behind that?
Okay, I will hit Alabama. And for those of you who want the specifics on all the states, just keep watching my website. The article hopefully will come up soon. We're working on it. In Alabama, we rely on sales tax for almost 50% of our tax revenues. Sales taxes hit the poor the hardest, period. We also tax groceries in Alabama. We rely on property taxes for very little, particularly the biggest landowners, and our income taxes reach deep into poverty and flatten out at low income levels. So all of that adds up to that the poor pay 5.7% more than the very rich when you compare the two. That's the wrong way. That's known as regressive. Regressive means you take a bigger bite as the pie gets smaller. Every state has their own flavor of injustice. That's what I have learned with this 3-year study of the states concerning how regressive they are, why they're regressive, and then, of course, there's the revenue issue. How well are they funding their schools? And other stuff, but I'm focusing on schools. And in Alabama, we are way below any reasonable measure of adequacy, particularly with high poverty school districts, which in Alabama tend to be disproportionately African American. So, kind of a spiral story. Did I depress you?
I'm going to go over here first.
For those of us that grew up in Southern Baptist Church, we would not dare say that tenth that's supposed to be the tithe that we theoretically would be paying, that's my money and I'm having to give it up, because we've been brainwashed correctly into thinking, no, that's God's money, it's not mine, and I'm just letting it, it's not so painful to turn loose of it. And yet I don't hear politicians, either on the right or the left, trying to get this across to people that this 15 or 20% that you're paying in taxes, it's not your money to start with. It's something you owe as a citizen, just like the tenth is something we owe as Christians.
And the question is, why is the tax debate void of moral obligation as a citizen, as opposed to the tithe debate? At least there's lip service of obligation to the Lord. Well, I think the answer is that we're closer to our local church than our government, and when you give money to your local church, you hopefully at least get appreciation from your pastor, and you can see you can more readily see the tangible benefits from it than you can from your tax dollars. That's more removed, and you don't get the credit. So I think it's back to this notion of sacrifice, that paying taxes is unpleasant because we don't get a pat on the back and we can't see the results as well. Except, of course, when some government bum wastes the money and gets indicted for federal crimes like we're having all over Alabama right now. We've got 2 high-level, 2-year college folks going to jail because they were pilfering the public money for their houses and other stuff, and that does a lot for public confidence, doesn't it? So, hand in hand with the moral debate about taxes, I didn't get into this in my talk, but your question brings it up. The church needs to be a louder voice for a moral demand for stronger ethics laws and accountability. And maybe if we can increase the accountability, we can increase the level of debate on the tax side. But you're never going to see the same commitment on the tax side as the charity to the church because of those close connections. And we have to work to overcome that.
What's the latest about the Southern Poverty Law Center out of Montgomery? I used to follow it quite a bit, but I haven't heard anything lately. What are they doing?
To be honest, the question was, what's going on with the Southern Poverty Center? And to be honest, I have no idea. They had a big whoop-de-doo in New York and gave the Morris Dees Award to somebody, but I'm not sure to who. And their big claim to fame in the 80s was, of course, they bankrupted the Klan over that lynching in Mobile. Now, I'm not saying they aren't doing good work, but I haven't heard much about them either. So I wish they'd call me, because I think we could work together.
I wonder if you'd comment on whether the present kind of tax policy related to solving the issues of our economic crisis that we face today, people losing their homes, unable to pay bills for medical and so on. How can tax policy be changed, or how should it be changed to deal with that issue?
Wow. Y'all are an awesomely intelligent audience. More so than me. The question is, how can tax policy be used to mitigate issues, people losing their homes, unable to pay bills, etc.? Let me start off by saying that a pure pointy-headed answer to that question would be, it shouldn't address it at all. Tax policy should be about raising revenue to run the government with a burden to pay in a fair way, and those other issues need to be addressed in other policies. That would be the perfect world. However, if you notice, the Internal Revenue Code, if you look at both volumes, not unabridged, is about as thick as this desk. And that's not even the regs. Because we use tax policy to try to do those things. The Earned Income Credit, for example, is designed to give money back to working poor families who are working full-time, but they can't make enough to make ends meet. They're still below the poverty line. My question is, why are they getting paid so little? And maybe other policies need to address the lack of a living wage. Now, I haven't done any research about that yet. But your question is an indirect way of asking me to do that. And so I'm batting 1,000. Everybody asks me to address living wage, and I always say it's on my list. What about medical issues? Our health care policy is a mess, is a disaster. I had a student diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease lymphoma. And at my law school, we're not very paternalistic, so we don't require them to get health insurance. And he didn't have it because he was between the gap of undergrad and law. That was a nightmare. I don't know how to solve the health policy issue, but it's clear that we need serious public policy work on that issue, and I don't think tax credits to working poor, you can have a $5,000 tax credit to go buy your health insurance. That, in my view, gut reaction, that's a gimmick. Home foreclosures, that's an interesting one. People taking out loans for homes they can't afford and not understanding the terms. There's two culprits going on here. One, you have the shyster lenders who take advantage of people who don't want to read, print that's so fine you need a magnifying glass. And two, frankly, you do have some people that bought homes they shouldn't have. You see, the right and left don't want to acknowledge both of those things. They want to cut one of them out of the picture. I'm sure there's a policy answer to that, but I don't think tax policy should be at the forefront. One of my points of growth, because we all like to think our area of expertise rules the world, or a famous tax jock once said that everything is ruled by tax and the rest of the world will accommodate. That's not true. There are limits to what tax policy can and should do, which does not diminish in any way the moral issues that you've just raised, or the fact that the Bible addresses them. And I'm going to make another plug, and I'm sorry to do this, but this is important. I'm a steward of knowledge. For some reason, God gave me an ability and a work drive to figure out this stuff that most people wouldn't even want to think about for 2 seconds, much less read about. I used to read tax notes like they were the comics. There's other stewards of knowledge out there in your pews. Stewards of knowledge that know something about the mortgage industry and would have something to say biblically how we need to address it. But they're just sitting there, just like I did for so many years, using their knowledge mostly for themselves. And they're stewards of knowledge in the healthcare area. Every complicated issue in our world today, there are stewards of knowledge that know a great deal about that area who are in the pews and are not using their knowledge for kingdom building. They're using it for kingdom destruction, just as I did for so many years with my own knowledge. And you, as the pastors and church leaders, must confront and challenge your stewards of knowledge in your midst to start using their God-given knowledge more for God's purposes. And if we do that, we're going to uplift all boats. Thank you for asking that question, very provocative question.
Thank you. You've made reference to your website. What is your website?
Well, the easiest way to get it is to punch my name in Google,
Okay.
Susan Pace Hamill, and it comes up first. And then it's got a wonko citation that I can't remember. I'm not a computer geek. It's got all my writings in PDF form. But I warn you, if you hit print, and it's among articles and book chapters as opposed to editorials and sermons, you better have a lot of paper in your machine. Just, some of them are 100 pages long. It takes time to document stuff.
And I'm sure this is answered in those footnotes or in those documents. It would help me if it would be possible to give a kind of a short list of the tax changes we ought to be thinking about advocating. I hear you sort of implying some, but it would help me if it could be a little more straightforward in terms of what do you think are the issues, the main ones we should advocate. Secondly, and I don't want to take us in a far afield direction, but since we're talking about morality and tax code, I thought I would at least ask the question, because I can't help but notice that you have not talked about the morality of taxation and the supporting of warfare.
Okay, let's take those separately. The first one is much easier. The question is, what general tax policy should we be pushing for? Well, first of all, the Bush tax cuts, they got to go. I'm sorry. And I'm really disappointed in John McCain. because he was against them in Congress. I'm wondering what happened. Obviously, some bully came and visited him in the dark of night. That was the stupidest policy, grounded in atheistic terms. It's run us into red ink, and they've got to go. So, sorry, and yes, they're going to say, oh, it's a big, big tax increase. Yeah, the ones that were paying proportionally more are going to go back to where we were pre-2001. Okay. State and local. Two things I can say right off the bat. You need to look carefully at your sales taxes and get those rates down, and if you're taxing food and necessities, you've got to stop that nonsense. How? You got to lobby your legislators. Now, I know that's no easy thing. I mean, having dealt with the Alabama legislature a little bit. But sales taxes have got to be whittled down as much as possible because they really pulverize the poor. Your state income taxes need to be made more progressive. If you're living in a state that doesn't have an income tax, which there's 9 of them, you need to get one, and that's no easy feat. Property taxes is a much, much harder kettle of fish to contend with in terms of the detail you need to know to really do it right. My study of state property taxes shows 2 patterns. One, there's a whole bunch of states that just aren't collecting many at all, and so the rich property owners are getting off scot-free. 2, some states are collecting either too much property tax, so they're pulverizing the middle classes and the poor, and they're letting the rich off kind of scot-free. And then some states are collecting what looks like to be globally a reasonable amount of property tax, but they're letting the rich off scot-free, and they're pulverizing the poor and the middle classes. And my upcoming article in the boring footnotes will have all of those percentages for your glory to study for your individual states. Your second question is much more difficult, the issue of taxation and war. Well, obviously, if we go to war, tax revenues have to pay for it. One of the purpose of tax revenues is national defense, defending our stuff from invaders, or as the case may be, invading someone else for their stuff, depending on your point of view. I am not a scholar. I have done no research on the area of just warfare. So I cannot comment on those particulars. As a private citizen who has read the papers and paid attention to the coverage of the Iraq War, the reasons for it, the true facts that came out later, I'm kind of appalled at what we're doing. And I'm real concerned about our troops. I have friends and colleagues that have young men and women serving. Every time I read about how we shortchange them in medical care and shortchange them in what they need when they come home, you see, all this is tax revenues. It breaks my heart. Yet we're perpetuating tax cuts for the rich, at least one side of the fence is, and indifferent to the safety nets for the troops. And it's no secret that poor and lower middle class young people serve in the Army, armed forces at a much higher rate than children like mine whose parents can afford to send them right to college. So we have serious justice issues embedded in our policy, even if we determined that the war itself was okay. How we're paying for it and allocating the burden for serving and supporting those who serve, in my view, the church needs to make some noise about.
Good, thank you. Susan, I'm over here with people on your far left.
All the way up, okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Peripheral vision.
I'd be curious to get your thoughts with regard to housing allowances for us as pastors, which allow us to make $50,000 or $75,000, and then to deduct $25,000 of that for rent, mortgage, cleaning supplies. What's the fairness in that, do you think? Or lack of?
Well, the question deals with special deductions and exclusions for pastors' housing as opposed to everybody else's housing. And I suppose we could extend that a little bit to tax-exempt status for property, church property, which covers not only the sanctuary, but also the gym, right? Is that fair? You have taken me deep into the detail of a world of which we call tax expenditures. Those benefits have nothing to do with measuring income. It has to do with helping out pastors and supporting religious endeavors, nonprofits. Personally, I think that there's a place for some of that. But if I were king, I would draw the line perhaps a little stingier than it's drawn. In other words, the struggling pastor who's making $35,000 a year and is living in the parsonage, I don't have a problem with excluding the value of the parsonage from income. Or if he or she has to get an apartment and then they deduct the rent. Because, it's no secret that for many, many pastors, it's a struggle. But I'm not as enamored with the TV evangelist who's making $500,000 a year and living in, the Palisades Palace, to call that a pastor, or at least from a measuring income perspective, to view that housing as the same. Obviously, I've presented the extremes. Ditto for the church property. I have no trouble exempting from property tax the church on the corner that's been there since 1800, that's modest in size. I have a little more trouble with the Palladial Palace Church that has a full gym, complete with exercise bikes and the whole bit. In other words, you don't have to join the country club, just join the church. And you don't have to pay property tax. The problem, of course, is how do you draw the line between those extremes? And that's one of the things that makes the Internal Revenue Law so complicated. But, as one famous tax jock said, complexity is one of the prices of fairness. In the area you raised, and I think this has something to do with me being a Methodist, maybe if I was an atheist I would say tax them all, why should they get any benefit? I prefer to struggle with that line than to throw the baby out with the bathwater. However, I do think that the line is a little too generous.
Right here in front of you.
I want to thank you for your tremendous words. We need that. I think primarily because I have observed over the years that we Baptist preachers, maybe Methodists too, and maybe some Presbyterians and others, but we Baptists get so hung up on Jesus that they really don't see any place for social justice. It seems like to me. How many times have you heard, well, he knew Jesus. He was in his straits, but he knew Jesus. As if that sort of thing. We need people like you who can remind us of the broader span of the gospel. Because Baptists are notorious, it seems to me, about being less involved in social justice, tremendously involved in politics, but not social justice. But they so much love Jesus that they've lost some of the social stuff, and we need your help. And maybe you should teach us.
I think the question is, how can we expand our love and understanding of Jesus to embrace broader concerns? There's no substitute for hard work, ladies and gentlemen. And in order to truly love Jesus, we have to understand his message, and that requires more than reading a few favorite passages out of context. It requires real Bible study. For this thick-headed lady, it required going back to school into seminary to figure it out. Now, I hope that's not true for most of you, otherwise we're in trouble because the seminaries aren't big enough to hold everybody. But as pastors, I think there needs to be more careful study of the gospel and of the whole message, and how would the principles that Jesus laid down for us 2,000 years ago speak to us today, because loving the Jesus 2,000 years ago and not applying that love of his message today is not really knowing him. But it's a tough task. Anything that requires work is a tough task. Work and sacrifice put together is usually dead on arrival for most people.
Good point. Over here, on this side over here.
Hello, thank you. You've made some wonderful points. And thank you. And being an engineer with weird brain thoughts, I'm looking from things the other way around. I think even if we could implement a lot of what you said and raise much more taxes, I think for me, a lot of our view is so many people are so disappointed in the way our government tends to spend the money that we do send them. Well, what can we do to work in that particular area?
Well, I think the question is, how do we deal with the public trust issues with government? And coming from a state, Alabama, that has about as little trust as you can imagine, for good reason, by the way, I well understand your question. Tax reform has to go hand in hand with ethics reform. What would ethics reform require? Well, I think every government budget ought to be on the internet. You know, we have freedom of information law. Well, in order to get information under the Freedom of Information law, you have to file a request to get it. And then the government agency, which includes public institutions of learning, can basically tell you to jump in the lake. I don't want to give it to you. What do you have to do then? You have to hire a lawyer and sue them to hand over the public information. And begrudgingly, if you do that, the judge will hand it over, and the judge will force the recalcitrant institution, which is all public institutions, not just the government, but anything funded by the government, such as public universities and schools, they have to pay your lawyer. Well, what public citizen is going to go through all that trouble? Don't you think we should have more transparency and put all of the expenditures on the internet and just have it there? So that if you're so curious, you can look on the internet and find out exactly how much your governor spent of your money doing this, that, and the other thing. Or your legislators. Or the grand poobahs of public university X. Or whoever. I think a good first step to government accountability would be to require all financial public information to be reported on the internet and applicable websites, no exceptions, put it out there, and if you're ashamed of it, maybe you shouldn't be spending the money that way. Because nothing grows worse than scum in darkness.
That is perhaps an excellent
Scum in darkness.
quote to end on. Professor Susan Pace Hamill, thank you so much. Would you join me in thanking our professor for this Q&A? I want to thank you. Be seated just a moment. I want to